one principle back to biology is this phrase, form follows function. And I like to tweak that a little bit. I say form informs function, or sometimes we reverse it, say function informs form. And that's not just a play with words. It's a bit of the chicken versus the egg. And the problem of it with sticking too much to the forms, I'll say, is that the forms become sort of sacrosanct and important in and of themselves, which again is fine if that's your priority. And therefore, we perhaps lose their value as bridges to function, to application. And so in a way, they become, let's say, more and more, I don't know if I would use the word dead, but less relevant for, let's say, real self-defense application situations. And in these lineages, maybe you ask them, what is this form for? They look at you blankly. What do you mean, what is it for? The form is the form. The form is for the form.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's not this idea that the form follows function or the form is informed by function. And so the problem is, in my opinion, that forms are secondary in a way, right? Chicken or the egg, right? Which came first? I would say that, say back in the day, someone got attacked, let's say with a downward strike, boom, right? And they got knocked out or they got injured somewhere on the top of their head or forehead, right? And actually, if you think about that very instinctively, if it's not too fast, right, that you have some time to react, most people would put their arms up, right? That's a form. It's not, in a way, it's something they made up, but it's not made up without context. It's made up due to the functional context. Something is coming downwards to attack this part of my head that I don't want to be impacted, and I use my arm to impact it instead, right? And let's say it worked. Wow. And then over time, right, that became codified as a form, formally. So that's my opinion. I don't think someone was just in their room or in their cave, right, without any external context, just bringing, making these shapes. Perhaps in some situations, like say meditation or where that energy develops internally, then the body moves in certain ways spontaneously. And so that's for a different reason that the body creates shapes. Right? Maybe it starts shaking to release some tension in their shoulders, so their arm flies out this way. But that's an internal context. That's to move some energy inside. So to me, martial context has to be some interactive and interpersonal, and has to bridge the internal and the external. So I'll just say that as my preamble to your question, that form follows function, or you can say form is informed by function, or function informs form. And in the martial context for self-defense, it developed because, for whatever reason, competition over territory, some or mates, right? And there was some physical altercation. And if you weren't able to create in the moment forms, shapes that were able to protect against, in this case, a downward strike, then you would die, and that would affect your your fitness, evolutionarily speaking, to be able to mate and procreate and pass on your genes. Right? So the genetic transmission, genetic success is affected by the mimetic creativity. What I mean by that is creating meaningful, in this context, meaningful shapes. Right? Memes are about transmitting information and meaning, and passing that on. Let's say, right, to your offspring or to your crew. Say, okay, however you communicate. If someone does this to you, right, you make this shape, right? And then the form becomes passed on mimetically, right? And then eventually, over decades, centuries, millennia, these became lineages that then gave names to these particular, you would say, movements or techniques that then became aggregated into what we call sets. So I'm using forms in different ways, but in this context, let's say form, I've used it to mean a specific shape of a technique, but I know nowadays form mainly means a certain combination, sequence of movements, techniques that are linked together, and I would use the word set for that. And yeah, and at this point, right, some of these forms and sets are hundreds of years old at least, and are strictly performed as such in some traditions, in some countries where the culture is more conservative, right? So respect your elders, and your point in life is to sort of pass on the traditions as is, versus, and again, maybe that's a more East, quote unquote. It's not so defined nowadays because of the internet and cultural transmission. There may be as many rebels, if you will, of tradition in the East now as in the West. But generally speaking, let's say, philosophically at least, it arose more in the West, this idea of analysis, the scientific process of breaking things down and testing them, right? Like physics, we have theoretical physics and experimental physics. It's very important to be able to test if these forms, right, these hypothetical forms actually would perform well in the Newtonian in the realm of Newtonian physics for applications, in engineering, right? And so we can even bridge that to martial engineering. It's not just, shouldn't just be theoretical. Let's see if actually this particular technique or combination of techniques are effective. If so, good. Let's actually codify them, put them formally into the forms. If someone struck down and then you did a sideways movement or a downward movement, okay, it didn't do anything that was effective to protect myself, so let's delete that, at least for that context, right? And so that's why all the forms are also different. Like, what are you imagining? You talked about the why, right? Perhaps even more important is the who. I want to survive, right, against this guy who's attacking me. Okay, that's the primary thing. And then, so when these different attacks come, then by context, I need to be able to pull out eventually spontaneously without overthinking the correct movement. And I'll finish there for a moment, that is why then forms are repeated, right? They give us a way to repeat certain movements meaningfully. Now, we can go further and talk about solo forms versus partner form also, right? So the solo forms require a little bit more imagination, right? Otherwise, you're just moving your arms, which is fine in that context. But then you have the partner forms, which are sequences, sets of movements where you kind of reciprocate with each other, and where then you can test out the form, right? And so then eventually, let's say free application is the direction you want to go to, maybe with multiple attackers, with even implements, weapons, and things like that. So